The light from the police car blared into the darkness, leaving behind a trail of eerie humming that was torn apart by the oppressive silence. All around stood tall buildings, immersed in darkness, like testaments to injustice. In this grim world, one policeman, ruthless and hardened in his prejudices, felt himself unpunished. Suddenly he noticed her, a black pregnant woman walking along the sidewalk, her belly jutting out like a symbol of hope. His eyes filled with hatred as he approached her. Thoughts of power and control raced through his mind, and he couldn't contain his anger. Punches flew, but the woman only looked at him in surprise. He didn't know that at this very moment, her life and the life of his life would collide with an unpredictable force. Raising his fist, he was ready to make a move that would change everything. But the moment the fist fell, the world around them froze. There was a crash behind the woman, and several figures emerged from the darkness. They were FBI agents, assigned to protect her. They quickly surrounded the policeman, and his face, full of confidence, turned to horror. What do you think will happen next? Leave your names and where you are watching this video from in the comments. It is very important for us to know who you are. Your opinions and support help us promote our channel and create more such exciting stories. You are really important to us, and your participation inspires us every day. Enjoy watching. The soft light of street lamps filtered through the dim city streets, illuminating sidewalks strewn with trash and shadows. In this environment, the mere presence of a black pregnant woman stood out like a spot of light in a corner of evil. She walked with her hand on her stomach, listening to the quiet movements inside her. Each step was difficult, and she tried not to think about what would happen if she became ill. She just wanted to go home. Meanwhile, nearby, in the shadow of a police car, stood Detective Johnson, his face contorted with disdain, his eyes like a predator stalking its prey. He frowned at the woman, his anger, sharpened by racial prejudice, flaring like a fire in a gas tank. "Hey, you!" he called as she passed, causing her to stop. "Where are you going?" The woman looked up and met his gaze. "I'm just going home," she replied calmly, trying not to provoke him. "Home? Are you sure this is where you want to be?" he said, approaching, his voice like the rustle of snakeskin. "It's time you learn to respect the laws of the city." The woman's heart began to beat faster. She knew that this policeman was no ordinary law enforcement officer. She could feel his hatred for her growing. "I am not breaking the law," she said quietly, trying to sound confident, but anxiety was growing inside her. Suddenly he grabbed her shoulder, making her tremble. "Don't you dare talk to me like that, you black slut!" he screamed as his fist landed in her stomach. Pain shot through her and she fell to her knees, trying to protect herself. Fear and hatred mixed in one spot at that moment. "You think you can get away with it?" he shouted, raising his hand, ready to strike again. But suddenly, other people emerged from the darkness. "Stop! Get your hands off her!" one of them shouted, and Johnson turned to see several FBI agents raising their guns. "What do you want, agents?" he said mockingly, not understanding who he was dealing with. The woman felt rage boiling inside her as she struggled to her feet. "I'm the FBI," she said, and in that moment the world around her seemed to freeze. Her voice was quiet, but there was a power in it that no one could ignore. "The FBI?" Johnson asked, his smugness momentarily turning to shock. "You're kidding, right?" "I'm not kidding," she said, trying to hold her head up despite the pain. "And now you're going to pay for it." At that moment, he realized that he had become a victim of his own prejudices. Fear crept into his heart, and his lips trembled with hatred. "I will do everything to break you, even if you hide behind a badge." The darkness around them thickened like a shadow stretching across the ground, and tension hung in the air like electricity. Every step, every word mattered, and the fate of both sides hung in the balance. Detective Johnson couldn't believe his eyes. He was filled with hatred for the black women he had always despised. But now, standing before her, he felt his confidence begin to crumble. The adversary he faced was not just another victim of his prejudices. She was a representative of the law he had broken. "You think a badge is going to save you?" he growled, raising the fist that had just crashed into her stomach again. "I'll teach you some respect, bitch!" He stepped forward, and at that moment several FBI agents who had been standing in the shadows came out of hiding. "Don't you dare touch her," one of them shouted, his voice full of fury. "You're in serious trouble, Johnson," but his words had no effect. "Leave us alone, you freaks, this is my job," Johnson replied, his eyes blazing with hatred. He threw his fist at the pregnant woman again, but this time she managed to dodge it, and the blow landed in the air. But the power of his hatred was so great that even the shadow he cast on the ground seemed ominous. The woman, realizing she was more than just a victim, gathered all her strength. "I'm not just a black woman, I'm an FBI agent, and you're going to pay for this," she screamed, raising her hands as if preparing for a fight. Johnson, not wanting to accept her challenge, stepped towards her threateningly. "You think I'm afraid of you? I'll punish you even if you're in uniform." His voice was angry and threatening. She grabbed the phone and quickly dialed the number, but he snatched it from her hands, squeezing it furiously in his palms. "How dare you call? You will answer for this," he growled, and then, turning sharply, pushed her so that she fell to the ground again. "You're not the first one to fall into my net," he added, grinning at her as she tried to rise to her feet, bowed to the ground in pain. "You don't understand the trouble you've gotten yourself into, you black fool." The FBI agents gritted their teeth in rage as they watched the scene. They couldn't intervene without breaking the law, but they knew time was running out. "We have to intervene or she won't survive," one of them said, his voice strained. The woman, feeling the pain spreading throughout her body, stood up with difficulty, wiping the blood from her lips. "You can't stop me, Johnson. I won't be afraid of you," she said, and there was a strength in her voice that he hadn't expected to hear. "Brave girl," he said, grinning, "but you will still be in my hands. Learn to respect those in power." He rushed at her again, this time intending to finish her off with one powerful blow. At that point, one of the FBI agents, losing his patience, lunged forward, grabbing Johnson by the shoulder. "That's enough. You're under arrest for assaulting a federal agent," he yelled, pulling him away from the woman. Johnson turned, his eyes full of fury. "You have no right to touch me," he screamed, pushing the agent away. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The woman leaned against the wall and watched the conflict unfold. The pain in her stomach was growing, and she knew she had to hold on. "Your hatred will not stop justice," she said as Johnson lunged at her again, his fists clenched. The situation was escalating, and a crackling sound could be heard over the sounds of the city. Johnson was rushing toward her again, and the FBI agents, realizing they could wait no longer, rushed into action to stop the cop they once were supposed to protect, but had now become a symbol of racism and hatred. As the tension mounted, a sense of foreboding hung in the air. The FBI agents, realizing they could no longer remain in the shadows, rushed forward, ready to stop Johnson, who seemed to have completely lost control. Their footsteps were sharp, and their eyes were blazing with fury. "Stay away from me," Johnson screamed, his face twisted in hatred as he turned back to the woman. She still had her hands pressed to her stomach, feeling how every second of this violence could spell disaster for her child. "You can't run from me," he lunged at her, his fist rising again, aiming for her face. But at that moment, one of the agents ran closer and grabbed Johnson's wrist, holding it in a grip. "Stop! This is not your game," the agent shouted, his voice filled with furious defiance. The cop, feeling himself being restrained, cowered like a trapped animal. He wrenched himself free, turning and throwing a furious punch at the agent's face. Blood sprayed as Johnson's fist connected with the officer's face, sending him to the ground, unable to keep his balance. The woman, seeing this, felt anger rising inside her. "Enough!" she screamed, raising her voice to be heard above the noise of the struggle. "You're not only a policeman, you're a criminal." Her words, filled with power, seemed to reverberate through the air like a gunshot. Johnson stopped, uncertainty flickering in his eyes, but the hatred did not leave him. "You should have stayed where you were, you black slut," he growled, not noticing how his words were becoming more and more insane. At this point, other agents began to surround Johnson, preparing to arrest him. "You're surrounded, Johnson. Lay down your weapons and surrender," one of them said, his voice firm. But Johnson, as if he hadn't heard them, continued to look at the pregnant woman with disdain. "You think you can just stand in my way? You don't know who you're dealing with," he barked, aiming his gun at her again. The woman, bending over to the ground, clutched her head and gathered her last strength. "I know who you are. You are a traitor. You do not deserve to be a policeman." Her voice sounded with force, and she stood up again, despite the fear and pain. Johnson, blinded by rage, lunged at her again, but the agents stopped him. They rushed at him in rage, trying to wrestle the gun from his hands. In the chaos, he screamed again, and his fist hit one of the agents in the chest, choking him. "Hold him!" one of the agents shouted, rushing to help his colleague. They fought him like a wild animal, full of hatred and madness. The woman, watching the struggle, felt a fire burning in her heart. "You can't cover this up. Hatred and racism are crimes against humanity," she screamed, and her words seemed to lift the spirits of the agents. They knew she was their ally, even if she was alone. Johnson, realizing his fortress was crumbling, began to panic. His hatred for women and the color of her skin seemed to wash over him like a wave, and he felt his time was up. His insecurity turned to madness. "I'm going to destroy you all," he screamed as the agents began to cuff him. "Not today," one of the agents said boldly, his voice loud and confident. And in that moment, when it seemed that hatred had almost won, the light of justice shone upon them. The woman, feeling her fear begin to recede, turned her gaze to Johnson, and in his eyes she saw uncertainty, a panicked reaction to the realization that his world, built on prejudice, was now crumbling. He was trapped in his own fears. The events seemed to unfold in slow motion. Johnson was on the ground, his hands behind his back, and the FBI agents surrounded him like wild animals ready to attack. The woman stood there watching, feeling a sense of triumph building inside her. "This is just the beginning, Johnson," she said, her voice filled with confidence and strength. "The truth will always come to light, and hate cannot survive." Johnson, on the ground, struggled to break free from the agent's grip. His rage only grew, like a fire that filled his heart with hatred. "You're all paying for this," he screamed as one of the agents pulled on his handcuffs, his hands creaking under the pressure. The woman, standing to the side, felt her heart sink. The horror of what might happen filled her mind as she remembered what Johnson had told her just moments before. "You can't leave me." His words rang in her head like a curse. She knew that if he could, he wouldn't stop until he broke her. "Tell him not to move," one of the agents shouted, trying to keep the situation under control. Johnson, tensing his muscles, glared at the agents standing over him. "You think that will stop me? I'm a policeman," he screamed, trying to get out of the handcuffs. His voice sounded like the cry of an evil spirit, full of aggression and rage. He felt the anger overwhelm him, and at that moment, it was as if he was ready for the final blow. The woman, unable to stand aside, came closer, her voice full of determination. "You are not a policeman. You are a criminal. You have harmed me, but I stand here. You will not break me." Her words sounded like a spell, and fear was gradually replaced by strength. Johnson, still struggling to break free, screamed as if his soul was being torn out. "You're nothing but a black slut. You'll never be on my level." He turned sharply to face her, his eyes blazing with hatred. At that point, the agents began to rise, realizing that Johnson could no longer remain free, but even they could not have anticipated how deeply ingrained his racism was. He rose to his feet, pushing one of the agents in the chest and breaking free of his grip, his face twisted in hatred. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he shouted, preparing to attack the woman again. "I'll make you regret what you did." It was all happening too fast. The woman felt fear rising up inside her again, but at the same time her anger was boiling. She knew she couldn't let herself fall. "You can't intimidate me," she shouted, her voice confident, but fear still raging inside. The agents, seeing Johnson ready to attack again, rushed towards him, but he managed to take a step towards the woman. "You will always be insignificant. You mean nothing." He threw an angry look at her, and at that moment one of the agents grabbed him by the shoulder again. "We're not letting this go," the agent yelled, and using all his strength, he tackled Johnson to the ground. The woman watched in horror as the officer rolled down the sidewalk, his fists clenched like an animal who realizes he's trapped. Johnson lifted his face, a bead of sweat appearing on his forehead. "You don't know what I'm capable of. I'll make you pay for this." His words sounded like a curse, and he tried to get up, but the agents, realizing he was furious, began to hold him down. "That's enough, Johnson," one of the agents shouted, his voice hard and confident. "You're under arrest for assaulting a federal agent. You can't abuse your power anymore." With each passing second, the woman's fear subsided as she realized that justice was finally beginning to prevail. She took a step forward, watching Johnson being pushed in handcuffs toward the police car, and she felt her anger and fear mixed together to create a new, powerful momentum. But Johnson, like a wild animal, continued to resist. "This isn't over. I'm still going to find you. You can't hide," he screamed as he was pushed into the car, his face twisted in anger. The agents, acting quickly, blocked him, and one of them, pressing his knee into his back, said, "You have lost. Everything you hated has now won. We will not allow the likes of you to rule this street any longer." The woman, looking at Johnson, felt the tension in her body begin to subside. Her throat tightened with excitement, but she knew it was not the end. This was only the first step to defeating the hatred that permeated society. "You cannot intimidate us," she said, her voice becoming confident and strong. "Every blow you strike will become fuel for us. We will fight, and your hatred will not stop us." The woman, standing on the sidewalk, felt her heart pounding in her chest as Johnson was taken into a police car. She couldn't shake the fear for her unborn child, and couldn't forget how every blow she took could hurt him. But at the same time, her anger only grew. She knew she had to be strong not only for herself, but for her child's future. "This isn't just my fight," she thought, looking at the gray walls of the city that seemed to swallow everything around them. "This is a fight for him, for his future." Her hands clutched her stomach tightly, as if she could protect her child even in a defenseless position. The FBI agents began to gather around her, confident that she was unharmed. One of them came closer, his face full of sympathy. "Are you okay? We can call paramedics," he said, his voice calm but with a hint of concern. She nodded, but then stopped, remembering that all her energy was focused not on herself, but on Johnson. "No, not now. I have to be here," she said, her voice firm. "I want to see him arrested. He has to answer for what he did." The other agents looked at each other, and one of them sighed heavily and added, "We understand, but it's important that you stay safe. You need to take care of yourself and the baby." At that moment, a sound came from the police car that made her heart clench. Johnson, still handcuffed, screamed, "You'll never amount to anything. You'll always be a black slut who doesn't know her place." His words cut through her like a sharp blade, and for a moment she felt fear wash over her again. How can he say that? She thought, her eyes starting to fill with tears. She clenched her teeth to keep from showing weakness, but her body, overwhelmed by pain and stress, couldn't escape the consequences. She felt a sharp pain in her lower abdomen and stopped, pressing her hands to her stomach. "Not now," she whispered, her voice shaking. The agents noticed her condition and came closer. "Are you sure you're okay? You need to rest," the same agent said again, his eyes full of concern. "I can't leave," she replied, her voice quieter but just as determined. "I have to be here when he gets his punishment." At this point, Johnson, trying to break free, shouted again, "You cannot hide from me. I will find you when I get out. You will not escape me." He was like a wounded animal, ready to do anything to maintain his power. The woman felt her heart beat faster again. He really believes this, she realized, feeling his hatred seeping into her consciousness, but at the same time a spark of hope flared in her soul. "No, he will not win. I will fight for my child, for our future. I will not let hatred break me." The agents standing next to her noticed her reaction. "We'll take him into custody, and he won't be able to touch you again. You're safe," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. She nodded, but she knew the real fight was still ahead. Every step toward justice required her strength, and every time she saw Johnson's face, images of fear and pain came to her, but the fire of the fight for her unborn child burned even stronger in her heart. When Johnson was finally locked in a police car and driven away, the woman took a deep breath, feeling the tension slowly melt away. She knew that victory had not come easy, but it was only the first step on a long journey. "I will do anything to protect you," she whispered to her stomach, her eyes filled with determination. "You will not grow up in a world of hate and fear. I will give you the best." Knowing she wasn't alone gave her strength. She could take care of herself and her future, and now that Johnson was no longer available, she felt an invisible thread of confidence connecting her to others. With every step she took toward the light of her life, she realized that she was not only fighting for herself, but for all those thousands of voices that had been silenced by hatred. She would not be the only one to rise up and fight for justice. "This is just the beginning," she thought, watching the police car with her enemy driving away. "I will fight, and we will win." As the police car disappeared around the corner, the woman felt excitement and relief warring in her chest. but fear soon followed, like a cold wave washing over her. Her heart pounded, reminding her that the danger was not over. She knew Johnson had only been temporarily stopped, but his threat remained. Her stomach ached again, and she pressed her hands to it, trying to calm herself and the baby. "Don't be afraid. Everything will be okay," she whispered, but her voice was shaking. Each sharp breath was a reminder that she was responsible not only for her own life, but for the life of her baby. As the FBI agents continued to gather evidence and discuss what to do next, she felt panic creeping up on her. What if Johnson gets out? What if he comes back? These thoughts kept running through her mind. Every second she spent outside felt like an eternity, filled with uncertainty and fear. She felt another sharp pain, and her hands instinctively clenched around her stomach. She saw one of the agents, observing her condition. "Come closer. You need to seek medical attention," he said, but she felt his solicitous tone only heighten her anxiety. "No, I can't leave," she cried, her voice full of despair. "I need to know he's going to be okay." The agent, realizing she needed to be reassured, said, "We'll take care of you. You don't have to worry about him threatening you. We'll increase security." But the woman knew that no amount of security could take away the fear that had settled in her heart. Johnson was more than just a cop. He was a symbol of hatred and injustice, and she couldn't afford to be vulnerable. She had to be strong. "I can't just leave until he pays for what he did," she said, her voice firm despite the pain. Her eyes filled with tears, and she felt the fear and anger wash over her again. At that moment, she noticed one of the agents exchange glances with the others, as if discussing something important. What are they going to do? Flashed through her mind. Fear gripped her as she realized that they might leave her alone, that she might run into Johnson again. "Please don't leave me," she said, her voice shaking with fear. "I don't want to be alone. I can't. We're not going anywhere," said the agent who had come closer. "You'll be guarded until we know you're safe." Still, the woman was still tormented by anxious thoughts. She looked around, as if expecting to see Johnson appear from around the corner. Every sound, footsteps, rustling, voices, made her wary. She was on the verge of hysteria. Her heart was beating faster and faster, and sharp pains were again heard in her stomach. "What if he comes back? What if he tries to get me when I'm alone?" she thought, trying to suppress the panic thoughts. She remembered the way he looked at her, how his hatred filled everything around her. How could he be so cruel? Her hands continued to clutch her stomach, and she felt fear wash over her like a black wave. She had to fight not only for herself, but for her child. She couldn't let herself break, couldn't let hatred win. The agent, noticing her condition, came closer. "Tell me what you need. We will do everything to help," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "I need you not to leave me," she whispered, looking into his eyes. "I don't want to be alone. I don't want him to come again." He nodded, understanding that her fear was not just emotional, but physical. "Okay, we'll stay with you. We'll make sure you're safe." Still, her mind wandered. She thought about the future, how she would raise a child in a world full of hatred and prejudice. How can I protect him? How can I show him that the world isn't as horrible as the one I live in? These questions plagued her. As the agents discussed their plans, the woman stood up, her legs shaking, but she forced herself to walk. "I have to be strong," she whispered, pressing her hands to her stomach. "I can't let fear win." She looked back again, feeling a chill run down her spine. Every time her gaze crossed the street, her heart sank. "I have to act. I can't wait," she decided, her eyes gleaming with determination. Deep down, she knew that the fight for her child was just beginning. She couldn't let Johnson, this evil force of hate, ruin her life and the life of her child. She had to be prepared for anything, even if it meant facing her own fear. The woman stood on the sidewalk, her heart pounding in her chest. All thoughts of the future and her child were mixed with worry. The FBI agents continued to discuss the situation, but in her head, all she could hear were Johnson's words, his menacing voice, full of hatred. She tried to focus on breathing, but the worry was growing, like a shadow creeping into her consciousness. Suddenly, a siren sounded on the horizon. The woman's heart sank. It seemed to her that the sound was approaching her, growing louder with each passing second. She could not shake the feeling that Johnson had returned, like an ominous ghost who would not leave her alone. "It's him," she whispered, her voice shaking. Fear had washed over her again. She looked out onto the street, as if expecting him to appear around the corner. The agents, noticing her condition, exchanged glances. One of them, an agent named Smith, came closer. "Everything okay? We're close," he said, trying to calm her down. But her gaze was fixed on the street, where a police car was already appearing. "He will come back. I can feel it," she said, her voice shaking with fear. "Don't worry, we've got him under arrest. He can't hurt you," Smith said, but his confidence was thin. They all knew Johnson's hatred was stronger than they could have imagined. And then, as if the universe had decided to play a cruel joke on her, the police car pulled up to the curb and Johnson stepped out, his face filled with anger and hatred. His eyes, full of fury, met hers and she felt a cold sweat run down her back. "You thought you could get rid of me?" he shouted, his voice full of venom. He lunged forward, but the agents, realizing the situation was getting out of control, quickly blocked his path. "Stop, Johnson," one of the agents shouted, but his words were little more than a whisper amid the raging fury. "You'll pay for this," Johnson howled, his voice like booming thunder. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The woman felt her fear turn to terror. She knew this wasn't just a fight between her and Johnson. It was more than that. His hatred and racism were spilling out like a raging torrent, and she was in his line of sight. "Quick, lock him down," Agent Smith shouted, and several agents began to try to hold Johnson back, but he struggled in their arms like a wild animal, full of hatred and rage. She watched this with a sinking heart, realizing that every step he took towards her was a step towards her fear, towards her concerns for the future. "No, not this," she thought, clutching her stomach, trying to calm herself and her child. Johnson turned around and, breaking free from the grip, screamed, "You must know that I will always be there. I will find you, even if it is the last thing I do." His words were like the tip of a knife piercing her soul. "Get away from me," she screamed, her voice unsure but with a hint of strength. "You can't control me. I won't let you ruin my life again." Agent Smith, trying to control the situation, came closer to her. "Get out of the way. We'll stop him," he said, but his voice was worried. He knew Johnson was dangerous, and even his confidence could crumble in an instant. At that moment, Johnson turned to her, his face contorted with hatred. "You're nothing. I'll make you regret what you did." Every word he said was a threat, and the woman felt fear grip her heart again. She knew it wasn't just a physical threat, it was a challenge to her existence, to her right to be a mother. The agents, realizing the situation was becoming critical, began to act faster. "Stop him," Smith shouted, and the agents rushed toward Johnson. But Johnson, sensing danger, rushed forward. "You can't escape me," he howled, his words filling the space like an echo bouncing off the walls. The woman felt her legs weaken and she took a step back as fear filled her mind. But suddenly, as if awakening from a nightmare, she felt her instincts kick in. "I won't let him win," she thought, her anger flaring. She couldn't let Johnson's hatred get the better of her. At that moment, the agents managed to grab him and he was back on the ground, but his face, full of hatred, was still looking at her. "I will find you. You will not be able to hide," he screamed, and a spark of madness burned in his eyes. The woman, still clutching her stomach, felt anger fill her soul. "You can't break me," she said, her voice full of determination. "I will fight for myself and for my child. Hate will not win." The agents, realizing the situation could get out of hand, quickly arrested Johnson and took him away under guard, but the fear that he might return remained with her like a dark foreboding. She knew this fight wasn't over. Every blow, every scream was just the beginning, and more than ever, she knew she had to be prepared for her life to change forever. When the agents finally apprehended Johnson and bundled him into a patrol car, the woman felt her tension ease a little, but suddenly, as if dark clouds were gathering on the horizon again, Johnson, restrained only by handcuffs, began shouting threats. "You will all pay for this," he screamed, his voice breaking with rage. "You black slut, you think you can get away with this? I will come back and you will regret ever having given birth to this wretch." The woman felt a chill run down her spine. Fear filled her chest again, but determination grew inside her. She was no longer going to hide. She had to show that hatred could not break her. At that moment, one of the agents, Smith, saw that Johnson was beginning to struggle against arrest. The police tried to hold him back, but his strength, full of rage, was like a raging torrent. "Hey, calm down," Smith shouted, but Johnson had already grabbed the arm of one of the agents, breaking free from the hold. Soon, the sound of another car was heard from behind. Another patrolman pulled up to help, and 2 new officers ran out. "What's going on?" one of them shouted, rushing to the scene. But Johnson, sensing the situation was heating up, took advantage of the moment. He jerked free of the hold, lunged forward, and shoved one of the agents, who was unable to dodge. The agent fell to the ground, and Johnson, wasting no time, lunged toward the woman like a demon returning from hell. "No!" she screamed, backing away, her heart pounding in terror. She wanted to run, but her feet were rooted to the ground. She was trapped, and everything around her seemed tangled in chaos. More screams were heard and other agents began to approach the scene of the confrontation. Johnson, like a beast, tried to break through to her again, his eyes full of hatred. He saw her and, overcoming her resistance, rushed towards her. "I will have my revenge on you," he shouted, and the threat in his voice was like a thunderclap. She saw his muscles tense, and the next second he lunged at her. As if in slow motion, she felt time stop. Her thoughts raced past her, and she took another step back, but it was too late. Johnson reached out and pushed her, knocking the breath out of her. She felt herself fall to the ground, and a sharp pain shot through her body. "No, not now," she whispered, clutching her stomach, feeling the fear creeping in. But at that moment, several agents ran up to her, and one of them bent down, helping her up. "It'll be okay," he said, his voice a rumble, trying to calm her, but the storm was still raging in her heart. She knew Johnson's hatred would not stop. Johnson, again struggling from his captors, spotted her and rushed towards her with such fury that she was again overcome with fear. "You can't escape me," he screamed, his eyes blazing like an animal's. But this time the agents were ready. They grabbed him, and there was a thud in the air as Johnson slammed into one of them. The agent went down, and everyone screamed as the impact sent the crowd back. "Stop! Calm down!" Smith shouted, trying to stop this madness, but Johnson's hatred was like a wave, sweeping away everything in its path. "You can't protect her," Johnson shouted again, his voice filled with wild anger. He returned to the fight like a zombie, still waving his arms as the agents tried to restrain him. There was another sharp impact as Johnson knocked down another agent, who fell to the ground, his face contorted in pain. Johnson's hatred and rage grew like fire, and he lunged at the woman again. "You will pay," he shouted, but at that moment other officers surrounded him, and finally one of them managed to grab Johnson by the arms, forcing him to the ground. The situation had reached its peak, and she knew it wasn't over yet. Every blow, every word he spoke was full of malice, and she knew the fight wasn't over yet. The agents began to work together, but Johnson, even though he was on the ground, still issued threats. "I will find you when I get out. You will not escape me." His words sounded like echoes that could leave a mark on her soul. She looked at him, feeling fear creep into her body, and knew that this situation was not yet resolved. Even if he was now under arrest, the hatred he represented still lived in this world, and she had to learn to defend herself. Her stomach ached again, and she pressed her hands to it. "I have to be strong," she thought. "I have to be ready for anything." The woman knew that her fight with Johnson was just the beginning. She couldn't just stand by and wait. She had to act to prevent herself and her baby from suffering the fate she so dreaded. Her spirit was stronger than her fear, and she knew she had to keep fighting. As Johnson, still struggling with several agents, continued to threaten her, the woman felt fear creeping over her like a dark shadow. Every scream and every blow resonated in her mind, like a reminder she couldn't ignore. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and she took a step back, instinctively hugging her stomach. "Please don't hurt him," she whispered, her voice full of fear. Her thoughts about the baby were washing over her more and more, like a dark wave, and she knew that her fear for his safety was becoming unbearable. Johnson broke away again and pushed hard at another agent who was trying to get closer. "You can't escape." His voice, full of hatred, sounded like a curse. He continued to try to break free, and each of his screams was like a bell ringing in her head. She felt like her world was crumbling, and her fear for her unborn child was becoming unbearable. "What if he hits me again? What if he manages to hurt my baby?" These thoughts were spinning around in her head, causing her to tremble. "Please, just calm down," One of the agents screamed as Johnson tried to stand up again, but Johnson's hatred, as if empowered by his anger, continued to mount. He knocked out another officer, and at that moment she saw the agents begin to lose control. "He's dangerous. We can't let him get to her," Agent Smith shouted, trying to keep the situation under control, but Johnson broke away again and looked at her, laughing, as if she were a victim awaiting her fate. "Do you think I won't find you?" he screamed, and her heart stopped. "I'll come for you. I'll make you suffer." She looked at him in horror, realizing that he wasn't just threatening her, he was threatening her baby. At that moment, fear filled her completely, and she realized that every time she fell or was in pain, her baby was in pain too. "No!" she screamed, her voice reflecting all her fury. "I won't let you do this." But fear was plaguing her thoughts again. She felt another sharp pain in her stomach and clutched at it, her hands clenching as if trying to protect her child from this nightmare. "Please hold on. Hold on," she whispered, looking at Agent Smith, who was trying to calm Johnson down. "He can't hurt you, I promise," Smith said, but there was worry in his voice, and she could feel it. Her instincts screamed, "What if he gets me?" She looked up to see Johnson rushing towards her again, his face twisted in anger. "You won't escape me. I'll make you regret it." His words hit her like a knife to the heart. The agents rushed towards him again, but each time they tried to stop him, Johnson squirmed out of their hands like an animal. She felt her stomach tighten again, and a sharp pain shot through her. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. She took a step back, realizing that she couldn't remain defenseless. As if responding to her inner fears, one of the agents, seeing the situation spiraling out of control, quickly approached her. "You need to get out of here," he shouted. "Now!" But Johnson, seeing her move away, rushed towards her again. At that moment she felt her heart stop. "No, please don't," she screamed, and tears began to flow down her cheeks. With every step Johnson took, her fear grew like a dark storm. She knew she couldn't leave her child, but how could she stop him? "I don't want him in danger," the thoughts ran through her mind, and she suddenly knew what she had to do. "I have to be strong. I can't let him break my family," she said, a glimmer of determination in her eyes. She wasn't going to give in. Johnson ran towards her again, and she felt anger wash over her, making her forget her fear. "You can't have me. I'll fight," she screamed, her voice filled with fury. At that moment, she saw the agents finally manage to grab Johnson and throw him to the ground, but his rage was still boiling over. He tried to break free and screamed again, "I'll find you. You'll pay for this." Agent Smith, realizing that the situation required immediate intervention, threw away the means of control, pepper spray. Johnson, not expecting it, screamed in pain and began to choke. There was screaming and noise all around when the agents were finally able to grab him and hold him. The woman, though frightened, felt her spirit begin to grow stronger. She knew that her son, her unborn child, felt her fear too, but now strength was awakening within her. She raised her head, and her gaze became firm. "I will not let hate win," she said to herself, her voice confident. In that moment, it became clear to her that her strength was not only in herself, but also in her child, who was about to be born. Johnson was arrested, and though his threats still hung in the air, she knew the fight was not over. She had to be prepared for anything to protect her baby and herself. She looked at the agents, and there was a fire of determination in her eyes. "I won't give up," she said, her voice full of confidence, now that she knew she had to protect not only herself but her child. Her fear became her strength. She was ready to fight. As the agents held Johnson down, the tension in the air gradually died down, but the fear for her child continued to rage in the woman's heart. Every sudden movement, every scream, and every blow echoed in her chest like an echo of the anxiety that had squeezed her heart in a vice. She pressed her hands to her stomach, feeling her belly tighten. "Please hold on, baby," she whispered, her voice shaking with fear and worry. Her mind raced as she thought about what was happening to her baby. Is he really feeling all this horror? Is he in pain? Tears streamed down her cheeks and she squeezed her eyes shut, trying to focus on something positive. She remembered how she had dreamed of this child, how she would love and care for him, but now that dream seemed threatened. Johnson was still under arrest, but his cries for revenge were like needles piercing her soul. "You will pay. I will find you and your baby." His voice was full of rage and hatred. She knew that even with him in prison, his hatred would still haunt her, and that fear was hard to deal with. How can I protect my child from this evil world? She wondered, trying to figure out how to keep her unborn son safe. She turned to Agent Smith, who stood next to her. What will happen to me? To me and my child? She asked, her voice shaking with fear. You're safe. We'll take care of you. I promise, he replied, though she could hear the worry in his voice. His confidence couldn't quite allay her fears. She watched the other agents discuss the situation, and she felt her stomach churning again. It was more than just physical pain. It was fear for her child's future. Suddenly she felt a sharp pain and her body tightened. Oh, no, she cried out, her hands pressing hard against her stomach again. What's happening? Everything will be fine, Agent Smith shouted, coming closer, but her fear was too great, and she began to lose control of herself. I can't do this anymore. I don't want him to get hurt, she screamed, her voice reflecting all the hopelessness that was overwhelming her. She knew that her body was reacting to stress, and that this stress could harm her baby. The agent, noticing her condition, quickly approached and put his hand on her shoulder. You need to calm down. Let me call the medics. They will help you, he said, trying to calm her down, but it did not ease her internal struggle. Dark thoughts swirled in her head. What if I lose him? What if this hatred destroys everything I dreamed of? She knew that her fear was real, and this feeling could undermine her health and the health of her baby. Suddenly she felt something snap inside her. Her heart started beating faster and she took a step back, pressing herself against the wall to keep from falling. Please don't leave me, my dear, she whispered, her voice full of fear and hope. She looked back at Johnson, who was still fighting the agents furiously. His every move reflected his hatred, and it left her with a feeling of hopelessness. In that moment, she realized that this man was not only a threat to her, but to her future, and she couldn't take it anymore. I won't give up, she said, though her voice shook. I will fight for him. I won't let hate destroy our family. Agent Smith came up to her again. Medics will be here soon. You need to stay calm. Everything will be fine, he said, although there was concern in his eyes as well. But her thoughts were already elsewhere. What if Johnson gets out of prison? What if he finds me again? Her stomach churned again and fear took over her. No, I have to stop this. I have to make sure he can't hurt me or my baby again. She felt her resolve begin to strengthen again. Despite her fear, she knew she had to think about the future, about what her baby's life would be like. She had to protect him at all costs. In that moment, as her mind swung between fear and determination, she saw the agents finally gain full control of Johnson. He was thrown to the ground, and they reached down to restrain him. She knew that now was her chance, the opportunity to begin a new chapter, a chapter where her child would not be in danger. I will protect you, she said, placing her hand on her stomach and feeling the warmth fill her. Despite the fear, despite the hatred that surrounded her, she knew that there was a fire burning inside her that would not let her give in. Her heart beat faster and she raised her head. She was ready to fight for her life and the life of her child. I will do everything to protect you. No hatred can break us. With each passing minute, fear and anxiety filled her more and more. And despite the fact that Johnson was under control, her thoughts did not leave the fears of childbirth. It was as if a storm was raging inside her. Every heartbeat reflected her worries, and with each passing moment she realized that time was running out. I can't think about Johnson right now, she decided, closing her eyes and focusing on her breathing. Every inhale, every exhale was filled with tension. She knew she had to get it together, because her baby was about to be born. Hold on, baby, she whispered, her hand going to her stomach again. The pain was coming in waves, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to remain calm. Please, just wait a little longer, she screamed silently, looking at the agents who were still holding Johnson. Suddenly, another wave of pain made her lean forward. She clenched her teeth to keep from screaming. It's just contractions. It's normal, she tried to reassure herself, but her mind wouldn't cooperate. Agent Smith noticed that she was leaning over again and came closer. You need to sit down. I'll call an ambulance, he said, his voice full of concern. No, I can't leave. I can't leave this place until Johnson is safe. Her voice shook with tension. She knew that all this time she had been not only a victim, but also a protector of her future. But your health is more important. The ambulance is on its way. You need to calm down, Smith repeated, but she felt her inner tension growing. Johnson, on the floor, watched them, his eyes gleaming with hatred. You think you can get away from me? I'll find you, even if you decide to run away. His words came out of nowhere. I won't run away, she answered, gritting her teeth. At that moment, the sensation of contractions came over her body again, and she realized that time was indeed running out. I have to give birth safely. I have to do this. The thoughts swirled around in her head. Please don't lose hope, she said, looking at the agents, but her voice was a little quieter. She could no longer control herself. The pain rolled through her body again, and she doubled over from it, clenching her hands into fists. I can't take it anymore, she said out loud, her eyes full of horror. It will be okay soon. We will support you, Smith said, his eyes full of hope, but her anxiety remained. Every time I feel this pain, I think about what could happen, she said, her voice shaking. What if I can't give birth normally? What if he gets hurt? You can do it. You're strong, and so is your child, Smith replied, but she felt the fear creeping up on her again. It was hard to wrap her head around it. How can I give birth when the hate is still here? Finally, after a few minutes of waiting, a group of medics burst through the door, their confident voices ringing in the air. What happened? Where is the pregnant woman? One of them quickly runs up to her, examining her. I'm going to give birth soon, she said, pressing her lips together to keep from screaming in pain. The medic quickly checked her condition, and a worried expression appeared on his face. You need to get in the car. Now, we have to get you to the hospital, he said, and she was overcome with horror. I can't leave this place. I have to be here when Johnson is apprehended. But her body was burning again, and she knew she couldn't hold back any longer. My baby, he's coming. I can't do this anymore, she screamed, her voice piercing the air. The medics exchanged glances, and one of them finally lifted her up, hugging her and supporting her. Come on, we can't risk your life and the baby's. You need treatment. Soon she was in an ambulance, her heart pounding like a fever. She tried to concentrate, but her mind was still filled with images of Johnson, his hatred and threats. How can I give birth in this atmosphere? She asked herself. As the ambulance sped down the road, she closed her eyes, trying to imagine what her baby would look like. She remembered all the dreams she had of holding him, playing with him, caring for him. I'll do anything to protect you, my little one, she said, feeling the pain return. With every impact of the tires on the asphalt, her fears continued to grow, but she knew that she had to be strong. She had to give birth and protect her child from this world of hatred and violence. I will do everything I can to keep you safe, she repeated to herself as the ambulance sped to the hospital, her heart filling with determination. Soon, after what seemed like an eternity, she found herself in a hospital, surrounded by bright lights and the bustle of medical personnel. The sounds of monitors, medical machines, and the calm voices of doctors and nurses filled her mind. But despite all the sounds, she felt her world narrowing to the pain she was experiencing. This will be the last time, she tried to reassure herself as she lay on the gurney, doctors preparing her for labor. But every wave of pain echoed in her belly, and her breathing became increasingly ragged. I can do this. I have to do this, she repeated to herself. The nurse, noticing her condition, came closer. We'll start soon. You need to focus on your breathing, she said with a gentle smile. But for the woman, every breath was a struggle. She knew she had to be strong for her baby, but fear still gripped her heart. Where is my husband? Where is my support? She remembered, but she knew that at this moment she had only herself to rely on. She looked at the doctor who had prepared all the necessary instruments and felt fear wash over her again. As the contractions began, she clenched her fists and closed her eyes, trying to focus on her thoughts. With every wave of pain came the thought that she had to protect her baby. She knew she had to do everything she could to give birth safely. Breathe, breathe, the doctor said, and her thoughts swung between her passion for life and her fear for the future. A storm raged inside her, and each contraction made her heart pound with new force. No, I can't give in, she screamed silently as another wave of pain swept through her body. Every time she felt her stomach tighten, she was overcome with panic. What if something goes wrong? What if he can't cope with this world? The thoughts squeezed her heart, and she knew she had to pull herself together. I will protect you, my baby. I will do everything to keep you safe, she said, but her voice was full of despair. Every scream and every sound she heard in the hospital reminded her that outside these walls, violence and hatred still occurred. Suddenly the pain hit again and she felt her body preparing for the final stage. "Come on, baby, I can't take this," she screamed, feeling her strength fading, but at the same time a fire igniting inside her. "You will see your baby soon. Breathe," the doctor said again, and her body filled with determination. She realized that now was not the time for weakness. She had to do this for her baby, for their future. With each contraction, each moment brought her closer to her goal. She felt her inner strength being restored once more. "I will not give up. I will not leave you," she repeated as the waves of pain came and went. Finally, just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she heard the doctor's voice. "We see the head. Keep going. You're almost there." It was like a bolt from the blue. She felt everything inside her change, and with every drop of sweat that trickled down her forehead, hope grew. "Come on, just a little bit more. You can do it," the nurse said, and her encouragement gave her strength. She concentrated on breathing, feeling her determination ignite again. "I will do it. I will be strong," she cried, and a look of strength shone on her face. The pain was unbearable, but a feeling arose in her that this was the time for a new beginning, a new chance. With one last effort, with every cry and last push, her body gave all its strength, and the moment she felt her baby finally come into the world, her heart filled with joy. She didn't need to look to know it was her child. She heard his cry, which seemed to break the silence, and in that moment, fear dissipated, giving way to boundless love. "This is my baby," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears of joy. She no longer worried about the hate, about Johnson, about what might happen outside this hospital. All that mattered was here and now. "You'll be safe, I promise," she said as doctors carefully handed her newborn son to her. Tears of joy streamed down her cheeks, and she felt her heart fill with a love that defied description. "Everything will be fine now," she whispered, hugging her baby, knowing that despite all the difficulties, they would cope with this world together. She was ready to fight for their future, and her love for her child became her strength. A few hours after the birth, the woman sat in the hospital room, holding her newborn son in her arms. The room was filled with soft light, and she felt how fear and anxiety gradually retreated, giving way to happiness and pride. Every time she looked at her baby, her heart filled with love, and the world around her lost its threat. "You are my hope," she whispered, holding him carefully to her chest. He was so small and defenseless, and this understanding only strengthened her desire to protect him from everything bad. But soon her thoughts returned to what had happened earlier. She couldn't completely distract herself from the memories of Johnson, how he had threatened her life and the life of her child. Will he really be able to get out of prison? What if he wants revenge? These thoughts tormented her again. Suddenly the door to the room opened and Agent Smith walked in. He looked a little tired, but his face lit up when he saw her. "How are you feeling?" he asked, coming closer. "I'm fine. The baby and I are fine," she replied, smiling, but there was still a hint of worry in her voice. "I'm glad to hear that. We've done some additional checking on Johnson. He's still in custody, but that could change," Smith said, and his words left her uneasy. "What does this mean? Will he be able to get out?" she asked, her heart pounding again. "Not at the moment, but we have to be prepared. I want you to know that we will protect you and your baby," he replied, trying to reassure her. "Thank you," she whispered, though her thoughts were dark again. She knew that even in the hospital, they weren't completely safe. "You need to rest," Smith said, but she felt a wave of anxiety wash over her again. "I have to be prepared for whatever might happen," she thought. Despite her fatigue, she couldn't just relax. With every minute spent in the ward, her fears grew. What if he decides to take revenge, even if he's in prison? After Agent Smith left, she hugged her baby tighter. "You are my protection, my life," she whispered, feeling his breath soothing her. She knew she had to do everything to protect him, even if it meant preparing to fight. A few days later, she was beginning to get used to motherhood, but the fear continued to haunt her. She was about to be discharged from the hospital, and she knew that this would be a new stage, full of uncertainty. No matter how hard she tried to distract herself, her thoughts kept returning to Johnson. One day, while she was feeding her son, Agent Smith re-entered the room, his expression more serious. "We have news," he said, getting her attention. Did something happen? She asked, her heart racing again. Johnson has appealed. He claims his arrest was wrongful and his case is being retried. We have to be ready, he said, and her world began to flutter with anxiety again. I can't believe it. He can threaten us again? Her voice trembled with fear. Don't worry, we'll tighten security around you while his case is pending, and if he tries anything, we'll be ready, Smith assured her. She nodded, but it wasn't enough to calm her heart. What if he manages to break free? What if he gets to us? These thoughts filled her mind again. Soon a nurse came to check on her and the baby. Are you okay? How are you feeling? She asked with a smile, but the woman felt her face couldn't hide the worry. I still worry about what happened, she admitted. I'm afraid for our future. I understand, but you're not alone. You have a team that will protect you. Just focus on your baby, the nurse replied, and her words were a breath of fresh air. Yes, I have to be strong for him, she said, looking at her baby, who seemed completely calm. His presence reminded her that despite her fear, she had strength that she could use to fight for their future. Despite all the difficulties, she knew that she had to stay strong. Her life had changed, and now she had a new goal, to protect her son and create a world for him free of hatred and fear. That night, as she laid the baby down to sleep, she looked at him with a heart full of love. I will do anything to keep you safe, my dear, she said, and her heart was filled with determination. She knew the fight was not over, but she was ready for any difficulties. She could not allow fear to take hold of her. She had to create a world for her son, and her love was her strongest weapon. A year after giving birth, the woman's life changed dramatically. She became a mother, and despite all the difficulties, she managed to create a cozy and safe world for herself and her baby, whom she named Daniel. Every day spent with him filled her heart with joy, and his laughter sounded like music in her ears. But there was still a shadow of fear in her. Every rustle outside the window, every ringing of the phone made her heart skip a beat. She couldn't forget about Johnson, his threats and hatred. She still received messages from her lawyer, who spoke about his case in court. We must be prepared for any eventuality, he repeated over and over. You are my strength, my light, she whispered to Daniel as she put into bed. His small arms wrapped around her neck, and the feeling reminded her of what she was fighting for. Despite her fear, she tried to create an atmosphere of love and care for him. Harmony reigned in the house, but her thoughts constantly returned to the threats from the past. One day, she decided to take Daniel for a walk in the park. Families were walking around, children were playing on the playgrounds, and everything looked beautiful. She enjoyed every minute of it, watching her son laugh and enjoy life. You're so happy, she said, smiling, as he launched a ball into the air. But soon her peace was broken. In the distance, she noticed a familiar figure, Johnson. He was standing at the edge of the park, his eyes full of hatred. The woman's heart sank with horror. She felt the world around her suddenly become dark. How could he be here? She thought, hiding her son behind her. Stay close to me, Daniel, she said quietly, trying to remain calm. She slowly began to move away, trying not to draw attention to herself, but he had already noticed her. Hey, you've been gone for a long time, he shouted, his voice threatening. She felt her legs begin to shake and her breath caught in her throat. Go away, Johnson, you shouldn't be here, she replied, trying to sound confident, although inside she was filled with fear. She knew she had to protect her son at all costs. He stepped closer, his eyes blazing with anger. You think you can hide from me? I haven't forgotten how you humiliated me. Now you're going to pay for it, he said, and the words were like a knife piercing her heart. Daniel, follow me, she shouted, scooping up her son and striding toward the park's exit. Tears were welling up in her eyes, but she knew she couldn't let fear get the better of her. I'll protect you, she repeated to herself. His voice came from behind her, getting closer. You won't leave so easily. I need you. I want back everything that was taken from me, he screamed, and she felt her heart pounding in unison with his threats. Finally, she ran to the car, opened the door and quickly put Daniel in the back seat. Hold on tight, she said, buckling him in. Her hands were shaking as she started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. Please, please, not me, she whispered, looking back in the rearview mirror. Her heart was pounding like a hammer as she saw Johnson standing in the parking lot, his face twisted in anger. She knew his hatred was stronger than ever. For a moment, She felt like she was losing control. What if he follows us? What if he gets us? Her thoughts raced through her head, but despite her panic thoughts, she knew she had to stay calm for Daniel's sake. When they got home, she quickly got out of the car and grabbed her son in her arms, trying not to attract attention. She closed the door behind her and locked it. Her heart was still pounding, but she felt that they were safe now. "We're home," she said, trying to sound confident, but the storm was still raging inside her. She knew Johnson wouldn't just back down. She had to prepare for what might happen next. Daniel, not understanding his mother's fear, began to play with toys, and this calmed her down. She hugged him close, looking into his innocent eyes. "I will do anything for you, even if I have to fight the devil himself," she whispered, her heart filled with determination. The next day, she decided to meet Agent Smith. She knew she had to take action and couldn't remain in fear any longer. "I need to know I can protect my son," she said when they met at the cafe. Smith listened carefully. "We can provide you with protection. We'll set up guards around your home and keep an eye on Johnson. You're not alone in this," he said, and his words brought her relief. She felt the weight on her shoulders ease a little, but she was still wary. "I don't want him to show up again. I need him locked up," she said with determination. "I'll do everything I can to make it happen," Smith assured her, "but you have to be prepared. Too, you have to be strong for yourself and for Daniel." With that thought, she returned home with renewed hope. She knew she couldn't let fear rule her life. Her love for Daniel was stronger than any fear, and she was willing to do anything to protect her son from the dark shadows that still haunted them. The woman knew she had to act to protect her son and put an end to the nightmare that had lasted for more than a year. The hatred with which Johnson had threatened her made her realize that she had to not only protect herself, but also do everything she could to punish him for what he had done. So she decided to sue the officer who had beaten her and the police department that had covered up his actions. After gathering all the necessary documents and evidence, she met with a lawyer who specialized in police abuse cases. He listened carefully to her story and, seeing her determination, agreed to take the case. "It will be a difficult process, but if you have evidence and witnesses, we can get justice," he said, looking into her eyes. She nodded, determined. "I'm ready to do anything. I have to do it." She reached out to her friends and acquaintances to find people who could corroborate her words. She managed to gather several witnesses who had seen Johnson behaving aggressively, as well as people who were familiar with her story. Each testimony brought her closer to her goal. When the case was ready, she knew that a long and difficult trial lay ahead. The trial began in a small courtroom, and she felt a growing sense of excitement as she sat next to her lawyer. She looked out at the room, where people were gathered, some supporting her, others curious to observe the case. The first session began with the presentation of evidence. The woman's lawyer began with her testimony. She stood up and looked at the judge with shaking hands. "I was pregnant when Johnson attacked me. It was a terrible night, and I still can't shake the fear," she said, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. The judge listened intently, and those in the courtroom exchanged glances. The woman continued to talk about how she tried to call for help, about how Johnson beat her, not giving her a chance to defend herself. Each word echoed in her soul, as if she were reliving that terrible moment again. When she finished, her lawyer called the witnesses. One by one, they took the stand to tell their stories. Some spoke about how they had seen her act before and after the incident, while others confirmed that Johnson was often aggressive and that his actions were unacceptable for a police officer. But then, when it was Johnson's turn to testify, the courtroom went silent. He looked confident, as if nothing was troubling him. His lawyer began asking questions, and he answered with a smirk. "She's just exaggerating. I was just doing my job," he said, and he sounded like he was right. The woman felt rage rise inside her. She couldn't let his lies go unpunished. When Johnson's lawyer finished, she stood up and asked the judge, "Can I ask a question?" The judge nodded, and she turned to Johnson. "How can you say you were doing your job when you attacked a defenseless woman? You knew I was pregnant. How could you do that?" Her voice shook, but she spoke with force. Johnson responded aggressively. "You're just trying to get attention. I don't owe anyone an explanation for my actions," he replied, but his voice was already sounding nervous. The woman knew that his words were just a mask behind which his fear was hidden. "I did not sue you to attract attention, but to show that such behavior is unacceptable," she said with determination. The judge intervened. "Please focus on the facts. "We are here to sort out the situation." The woman nodded, collecting her thoughts. She was determined not to let Johnson intimidate her. The next few days were tense. The court continued to hear testimony from witnesses and experts, each of whom confirmed that Johnson's actions were unjustified. She managed to hold on, but fear and anxiety still warred inside her. Finally, the moment came for her attorney to deliver his closing argument. He described how Johnson had used his power to harm a defenseless woman, how he had disregarded her safety, and how his actions had impacted her life and the life of her son. "We must send a message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated in society. Every person has the right to be protected, no matter their race or status," he said, and the words echoed throughout the courtroom. The woman looked at Johnson, his confidence already beginning to crack. She felt hope rising within her. "I have to win. I have to do this for myself and for Daniel," she thought. The judge soon retired to the deliberation room to consider his decision. The woman sat, her hands clasped, her heart pounding in anticipation. Each moment seemed an eternity. She thought of how Johnson had robbed her of her peace, how she had fought his intimidation, and how she now stood on the side of truth. Finally, the judge returned and took his seat. Silence fell over the courtroom. The woman felt her breathing become ragged. "We have reached a decision," the judge said, and his voice sounded as if each word was carved from stone. The woman looked into his face, feeling fear creeping up on her again, but now she was prepared for any outcome, because she knew that she had fought for her truth, and even if the outcome was not in her favor, she had already taken the first step to freeing herself from fear. When the judge finally pronounced his decision, the courtroom was silent. The woman felt her heart sink in anticipation. The judge looked at Johnson and said, "On charges of abuse of power, violence, and attempting to conceal your actions, the court sentences you to 8 years in prison." The words seemed to break the silence, and a low murmur could be heard in the courtroom. The woman could hardly believe her ears. Her eyes filled with tears of relief, joy and triumph. She looked at her lawyer, who was smiling at her, supporting her in this important moment. "We did it," she whispered, and he nodded, hugging her. She turned to her witnesses, who were joyfully hugging each other, and she felt a sense of unity and strength between them. They had all fought together, and now their efforts were rewarded. Johnson looked shocked. The confidence he had brought to court was now completely gone. He knew his actions had led to this result. The woman felt a sense of satisfaction as she looked at him, and deep down she knew he would now answer for his actions. The judge continued, "In addition, the court orders you to undergo a rehabilitation program. I hope that you will understand the consequences of your behavior and learn from it." He banged his gavel, and at that moment, applause broke out in the courtroom. As the woman left the courtroom, her heart was fluttering with joy. She looked at her lawyer and said, "This isn't just a victory for me. This is a victory for everyone who faces injustice." He nodded, understanding how important this case had been to her life and to so many others who had gone through similar experiences. "You now have the opportunity to change the world around you," he said. "You can be a voice for those who cannot speak." Her friends and family were already waiting for her at the exit. They hugged her, congratulating her on her victory. The woman looked at them, and her heart filled with pride. She understood that all this struggle was not in vain, that they did something important. But she knew there was more work to do. Not only had this process helped her, it had also started a larger movement against racism and police violence. She wanted to continue her fight so that other women wouldn't have to endure the fear she had. When they got home, she called her lawyer to discuss next steps. "I want to help other women who are in a similar situation. We need to form a support group so we can pool our strengths," she suggested. "That's a great idea," he replied. "Let's create a program that will help women and their children and educate them about their rights and protection." The woman felt a fire of determination burning inside her. She was no longer just a victim, she was now a fighter. She decided that her story should be an example for others. She spent the next few months building a support group. She collected stories from other women, their struggles and triumphs, and created a platform for them to share their experiences. Each meeting was emotional, and they became an increasingly close-knit community, supporting each other. They met each week to discuss how to best help others, how to change the perception of police violence, and how to create a safe space for everyone. She felt like this was her calling, and that she had finally found her purpose. The gathering became popular and soon local media began to pick up on them. They began to cover their activities, telling stories of women who were uniting to fight for their rights. This led to other groups springing up across the country, inspired by their story. The woman understood that with each new acquaintance, with each new story, she was not just supporting others, but also helping society change. She knew that every time they talked about their pain and victories together, they made the world a little better. All this time, while she was working on the project, Johnson was serving his sentence. The woman felt that she could now sleep peacefully, knowing that he could not harm her or others. The time spent in fear became a lesson for her. She learned to be strong, to fight and not to retreat. One day, during one of the meetings, a woman shared with the group members, "I want us to always remember that our happiness and safety are not only our rights, but also our duty to ourselves and our children. We must continue to fight for justice so that our children grow up in a world free of fear." All present agreed, and at that moment they realized that they were united not only by the bitterness of the past, but also by the desire for a better future. Their community grew stronger each day, and they began planning events and activities to bring attention to racism and police violence. The woman was no longer alone. She now had support, and together they were ready to change the world. A few months had passed since her court victory, and the woman's life had begun to change for the better. She continued to be active in her support group, helping other women who had experienced violence. Together, they organized events, raised funds, and did everything they could to create a safe space for those who had suffered injustice. One day, a young woman came to the meeting with tears in her eyes. She told how her own experiences with violence had left deep scars, and how she had searched for support for a long time but could not find anyone who understood her. The woman leading the group approached her and gave her a big hug. "You are not alone. We are here for you," she said, and in that moment she felt her own suffering become part of something bigger. She realized that she had been able to help not only herself, but also others, giving them hope. At this time, her son Daniel, who was already 1 year old, began to take his first steps. Each new day brought joy and smiles. The woman loved to watch him explore the world around him, and each of his mama filled her heart with pride. She knew that thanks to her efforts, she created a better future not only for him, but for many other children. One day, at an event, they decided to have a picnic in the park for families. It was a bright, sunny Saturday, and as they gathered, laughter and joy filled the air. The woman looked at her friends, the children playing on the grass, and felt happiness overwhelm her. It was a moment when she realized that the violence and suffering she had experienced did not define her, but, on the contrary, made her stronger. At the event, they also invited a local politician who listened to their stories and promised to support the initiative to reform police practices. This was an important step towards changing the system, and the woman felt that their fight was bearing fruit. Time passed, and soon the woman became the face of the movement for women's rights and against police violence. She actively spoke at conferences and in the media, sharing her story and inspiring others to fight for their rights. Every time she went on stage, she felt the support of her group, and this gave her strength. At one such conference, when she spoke about her journey and the importance of uniting for justice, her words were met with thunderous applause. The woman stood on stage, looking at thousands of hopeful faces, and in that moment, she realized that her suffering had become a catalyst for change. Soon, her support group received a grant from a charity to expand its activities. She and her colleagues were able to organize more events, provide legal assistance, and create a training program for women so they knew their rights and could protect themselves. A year after the trial, her life began to shine with new colors. The woman was proud that she was able to turn pain into strength and do something meaningful for society. She understood that the victory over Johnson was not only her personal victory, but also a victory for all women who have ever faced violence. One evening, as she and Daniel sat on the couch watching their favorite cartoon, she hugged him and felt her heart overflow with love. She knew she had done everything she could to ensure he had a safe future and that he would never have to go through what she had. The woman looked out the window at the sunset, realizing that her story was not the end, but the beginning of a new journey. Now she was a confident, strong and happy woman, ready to continue the fight for justice. She understood that she had a purpose, and that every day was an opportunity to change the world for the better. With each step she took, she was closer to her dream of a world where her son and other children could grow up safe, without fear, without prejudice, without violence. And although there were many obstacles along the way, she was confident that together with others, they could make a difference. So the story of a woman who survived violence became a symbol of hope, strength and resilience, and in the end, she found not only her justice, but also her happiness. The woman, now full of confidence and determination, continued her journey of change, inspiring others with her actions. Every morning she woke up smiling, looking at her son, who happily ran around the house, exploring the world. Each day brought new opportunities and hopes. Over time, her support group became famous not only in her city but also beyond. They organized workshops, taught women about their rights, collected stories that became powerful tools for fighting injustice. The woman felt that she now had a family, a community united by a common goal. Once, at a meeting, she spoke about the importance of believing in yourself and your strength. Each of us is a voice that can change the world. We must fight not only for ourselves, but also for those who cannot speak, she said, and her words were met with thunderous applause. With each event, with each story they shared, she realized that her suffering had not been in vain. It had become the foundation for a more just world. At that moment, she decided that she would continue her mission until she saw her dreams of safety and equality become reality. A few years passed, and her efforts began to bear fruit. She saw laws changing, public awareness growing, and more people joining their movement. Each step forward strengthened her belief that change was possible. As Daniel got older, she would take him to events, and he would listen with pride as his mom talked about the importance of justice and supporting each other. He knew his mom was a hero, and that gave him confidence. One day, at a large gathering of women from all over the country, a woman came up on stage, full of inspiration and pride. She spoke about the importance of believing in yourself, of being part of change. We have to be the ones who inspire others. We have to be the voices of the silent, she said, and the room filled with applause and approval. Her story of overcoming fear and adversity, of turning pain into strength, inspired many. She became a symbol of hope, and her life became proof that even the darkest moments can lead to bright changes. That day, when she returned home and hugged her son, the woman knew that her journey was not over, but she was ready to continue the fight to make the world a better place for her child and all future generations. In the end, her story ended not with an end, but with a new beginning, the beginning of a new world filled with hope, justice and love. Looking to the future with pride, she knew that all her efforts, all her battles were not in vain. She had made it, and together with others, they continued to move forward, creating the world they dreamed of. And, dear viewers, we would love to hear your thoughts on this story. What do you think about the fight against racism and the importance of uniting for justice? Have you ever experienced bias or discrimination in your life? Every comment you make means a lot to us. We value each of you and your stories. You are an important part of our community, and your support helps us continue to talk about the topics that matter most. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Your support inspires us to create even more interesting and meaningful stories. Have a nice day.